Lagim fam, before I start this episode, I would like to introduce you to a young, vibrant, talented Filipino-Canadian independent musician. Teresa, who goes by her artist name Cheese and Crackers, is from Peterborough, but her love for music has been greatly influenced by her Filipino mom. I will play you a short clip from a song she was featured in called Flutter, where she joined artist Brian, who is from Toronto and who takes inspiration from artists such as Jack Stauber and from genres such as K-pop and anime. See the show notes for more details on these two brilliant artists and make sure to follow them on Spotify.
So baby, please don't break my heart in two.
I want you to know how much I want to get to know you, 'cause you make my heart go, and I can't stop this feeling. My heart's beating way too fast and I can't let it show. I've never felt this way before. We're young and stupid, but I know I never wanna let it go.
You got me slipping, you got me tripping.
In Shakespeare's Hamlet, we see a very conflicted protagonist who thought and pondered about revenge so much that when he finally got to exact it, he did not really experience the kind of satisfaction he'd hoped for, and in the end, he died after being struck by Laertes. But despite Hamlet's indecisiveness about revenge, we understand from this play and other portrayals of revenge in popular culture that vengeance is a pervasive and inevitable reaction to injustice. Hamlet wanted to avenge his father's death. Carrie wanted to get back at her whole high school. Maximus survived near death to avenge his family and kill Commodus. And yeah, there's the whole plot of Kill Bill. But that is fiction. After the revenge scene, the story ends. The protagonist feels a sense of achievement, relief, maybe even pride. What is not shown in those movies is the ripple effect of these killings or any nuances, or the possibility that maybe, just maybe, the protagonist had killed or hurt the wrong guy unknowingly, or that maybe, despite being told he's exacting revenge on the wrong guy, still goes ahead with his vengeful plot, making him the antagonist in the end. Real life is quite different. It is messy, has lots of tangents, and people can never be viewed in isolation. Their absence will always have an effect on others. This is certainly true for today's case, where a revenge plot ended up destroying lives and affecting people greatly for years to come. This is the story of the Cochise Beebom double murder. Mabuhay Lagim fam! Welcome to another episode of Lagim, a Filipino true crime podcast. I am your host, Christine Abrigana, and this is episode 7. In case you have not done so yet, please follow me on social media to always be up to date about the podcast and to get some extra true crime content. All the links to my social media accounts are below in the show notes. By the way, I also have affiliate links for Shopee, Lazada, and even Canva. So if you're planning to make purchases from Shopee or Lazada, make sure to use my links. As for Canva, if you use my link, you can sign up and use Canva Pro for free for 30 days. If you decide to use it beyond the 30 days and pay a monthly subscription, I also get a tiny commission from your sign up. So please use the links, as in doing so, you would be doing me a real favor and also supporting the podcast. As always, details in this episode can be disturbing to some people, so please take care of yourself whilst listening. The Philippines in the early 90s was slowly recovering from the hangover of the Marcos era. Corazon Aquino was president still, but not for long. Someone from the Marcos era was waiting in the wings to become the next president. Fidel V. Ramos, who defected from Marcos and supported Aquino in her bid for the 1986 presidency, would soon be voted in as the 12th president in 1992. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The first 3 months of 1990 were full of contradictions. In January, for example, the formation of the Cordillera Administrative Region was rejected by most of its own voters, whilst the Autonomous Region of Muslim Mindanao, or ARMM, had held their first general election by February 1990. By March, Cagayan Governor Rodolfo Aguinaldo seized a hotel in Tuguegarao after his suspension 2 months prior. He was unsuccessful, but if you were a superstitious person back then, you would probably have interpreted this bad news as perhaps an omen of things to come because a lot had happened that year. A typhoon, a big earthquake in Baguio, communist threats, shooting at the US military base in Clark, just to name a few. But before the year unfolded further, the Filipinos would become captivated by something horrible that had happened in April. As in many stories, this case started with two sets of parents tentatively worrying about their children. But what was tentative slowly became definitive. Both the Bernabe and Castaños families knew that on the 25th of April 1990, their son Ernesto Bernabe II, also fondly known as Cochise, and his girlfriend Ana Lourdes Castaños, also nicknamed Beebom, were going out for dinner following a visit at Beebom's home. The couple exited the Castaños residence around 6:30 that evening and got into a green car to head to the heart of Quezon City. They planned on eating at Dairit's Ham and Burger House on Timog Circle. What they did not know at that time was that they were being followed by a black car with 4 passengers. After Cochise parked his car and as the couple alighted from their vehicle to head into the restaurant, 2 people accosted them. These 2 men were armed and identified themselves as police officers. Now, one of the 2 men proceeded to point a .45 caliber pistol at Cochise before handcuffing him. Cochise was visibly upset and asked in Tagalog, "Bakit? Why?" The question was ignored, and Cochise was forced to climb into the back of the car that just a minute ago he was driving. The other man, who also identified himself as a police officer, then turned to Beebom and pushed her into the back seat of the green car as well. The 2 strange men then took seats in front and backed the green car out of the restaurant's parking area and onto EDSA Avenue. The nightmare for Cochise and Beebom was just beginning. Cochise was 26 years old in 1990. He had just graduated from the University of Philippines Law School and was reviewing for the bar examinations. Beebom was 22 and a mass communication student who was about to graduate from UP as well. Both were excelling academically and in their extracurricular activities as well. I suppose you could say that although their families are not part of that glitzy Manila upper class, they were still somehow well connected. In an anecdote by Senator and current Vice Presidential candidate Kiko Pangilinan, he recounted his love story with megastar Sharon Cuneta and mentioned that Cochise was a high school friend. According to Pangilinan, Cochise's mother worked for Cuneta's father, then Pasay Mayor Pablo Cuneta, and every year, Cochise would celebrate at his home, inviting both Pangilinan and Cuneta. Cochise was poised to be a good lawyer. He was said to have good leadership skills, charm, and wit. He once expressed the desire to become president of the Philippines, just showing that he was ambitious and had a great love for life. As for Beebom, there's not much on the internet about her or her family, but from how the several twists and turns in this case were received by people who knew both Cochise and Beebom, it seemed to me that she too was much cherished and still missed by her closest friends and family members. So how did we get here? to this fateful day on the 25th of April. In order to understand that, we need to go back in time a little bit for a bit more context. The background story for what happened to Cochise and Beebom started with a man named Rodolfo Manalili, also called Rudy. His connection to Cochise and Beebom is important, so bear with me here. Rodolfo Manalili, or Rudy, is the brother of someone named Delphine Manalili. Delphine was married to a woman named Joy, who happened to be Beebom's aunt. And as we now know, Beebom is Cochise's girlfriend. Now, on the 8th of October 1989, Delphine was killed at a birthday party that was held at the Castaños family home, Beebom's home. Initial suspicions fell upon Cochise at that time because he was the only one who was deemed to have had the means to commit such a crime, meaning he had access to a gun. This easy access to a gun was said to have been the result of being the son of the chief city fiscal of Pasay. For non-Filipinos, by the way, a fiscal is essentially a prosecutor. Now, the assumption that just because he was the son of the city prosecutor, he must have had easy access to a gun may seem far-fetched to some, but for Filipinos, this would not be entirely surprising at all. Some government officials are known to abuse and misuse power that way, but in Cochise's case, this was an angle that I do not think was given much attention because of all the other major things in the shooting. Now, going back to this party, it is my understanding that there was a heated discussion during the birthday party, and from one moment to the next, the party guests were shocked to hear a gunshot ring through the Castaños family home. And then they saw Delphine on the floor, bleeding profusely from a gunshot wound sustained somewhere in his upper body. Now, according to one witness at the birthday party, they saw Cochise walking around with a gun. But it was also Cochise who later carried Delphine's body into a car that would take the wounded man to the nearest hospital. But here's the thing, no one had actually seen Cochise shoot Delphine, and this witness who allegedly saw him later with a gun was actually Beebom's auntie herself, Joy Manalili. As a result of Joy's statement, inferences were made that made Cochise look like he was the shooter, but objectively, one could also make equally convincing inferences that would provide for alternative explanations. Could Cochise have wrestled the gun from the real shooter after the shooting in order to prevent further harm? Was that the reason he had the gun in the end? He was the one who made sure Delphine was brought to the car so that he could be driven to the hospital. So, does this action prove guilt, remorse, and the need to make amends by minimizing the damage already done by the gunshot? Or was Cochise the only one who had the wherewithal to scoop up a dying man quick enough to get him immediate help? Circumstantial evidence like this can be argued both ways if you really wanted to. But one thing was clear from the witnesses at the birthday party: no one saw the shooting itself. But were they perhaps holding back about what they really saw, or did they really not see anything? When the Delphine Manalili case was finally being investigated, after he died at the hospital that same evening, Beebom was pulled in as a witness just like the others at that party. It was interesting to hear that despite the suspicions mainly falling upon Cochise at that time, Beebom dropped one completely different name as an alternative suspect. In her sworn statement, she said that it was a man named Roberto Herrera who had an actual motive to kill Delphine. Cochise lacked motive despite accusations of having the means to kill, meaning the gun. Roberto Herrera, as it happened, was at that time Joy Manalili's boyfriend who, as we know, used to be married to Delphine. I know what you're thinking. Why were both Joy's ex-husband and current boyfriend at the same party? I asked myself that question as well, and I could not find a clear reason from the reports at that time as to why all three of them were there, because it seemed like a surefire recipe for a love triangle disaster. It seemed to me, from what we already know now and from Beebom's mentioning of Herrera's name in connection to the shooting, that the argument I mentioned earlier may have been between the two men. I am assuming that Joy Manalili was somewhere out of sight at that specific moment when Delphine was shot. It could then be argued that Joy Manalili was not willing to name her current boyfriend as a potential suspect, and that was why she gave the police the information about seeing Cochise with a gun. It is also entirely possible that she really saw what she said she saw and made the same inferences as everybody else. But one specific person really latched on to the theory that Cochise was guilty of killing Delphine, and that was Rodolfo Manalili. He held on to that belief, and months later, he devised a plan for revenge. Rodolfo Manalili was out for blood, so sometime in March 1990, he tapped someone from his hometown named Filimon Garcia. He asked Garcia if he knew anyone who could essentially effect the arrest of Roberto Herrera, the latest suspect in his brother's killing. Garcia said he had someone in mind and would be meeting him soon. By the 21st of April, Filimon Garcia called up Manalili and informed him that he managed to contact a police officer who could possibly help him out. The police officer, however, wanted to have a word with Manalili first, so an appointment was agreed for the 22nd of April 1990 at midday in Mabalacat, Pampanga. The next day, Manalili and his son Richard went to the meeting place agreed with Filimon Garcia. Garcia was already there when they arrived. The three men then went to a restaurant to meet the police officer named Roberto Lising, who was an active and serving police officer for the Pampanga Intelligence Unit. The venue was then changed last minute, and the four men ended up meeting at a carinderia, which in the Philippines is essentially a food stall with a small sitting area usually found at marketplaces or roadsides. Now, the meeting was also joined by another man named Enrico Dizon and yet another unnamed individual. We only know that this mystery person was armed with a service pistol, indicating that he might have been a police officer as well. Now, in that meeting, Manalili told the other man that he was willing to pay 50,000 pesos for this quote-unquote arrest job that he initially told Garcia about. A down payment of 2,000 pesos was made that very same evening, with the extra instruction that the men should see someone named Vic Nabua, who would then point them to the person that needed to be arrested. Now remember that the person to be arrested was located in Quezon City, in the country's capital, and yet Manalili, a private citizen, was somehow going around hiring police officers from Pampanga to arrest Herrera. Remember this bit for later on, as it will become important. After the meeting concluded, the group was now poised to start their work. Lising and Dizon went on to recruit one more person into the group. His name was Robin Manga. By the 23rd and 24th of April, the group headed to Quezon City to meet with the man known as Vic Nabua. Their first order of the day was to conduct a surveillance of the Castaños residence in the hope to see Roberto Herrera. These 2 days were rather uneventful, as they did not seem to have seen Herrera at all. I am assuming here that Manalili gave them information about how Herrera looked like, how he was either a regular fixture or visitor at the Castaños residence, or that he probably lived there. Now, in an attempt to finally see and find Herrera, the group came back the next day on the 25th of April. They arrived around 5 in the evening and parked some 60 meters away from the residence. Shortly after this, a man who entered the residence was identified by the group as being Roberto Herrera. By 6:30 that evening, a young man and woman, who we now know was Cochise and Beebom, exited the Castaños residence and left in Cochise's father's green box-type Lancer car. So a few minutes ago, we have already heard how Cochise and Beebom were abducted. We now have to slightly forward our timeline after the convoy of the green and black cars left Quezon City. As you will remember, Cochise and Beebom, Enrico Dizon, and Robin Manga were in the green car, whilst Filimon Garcia and Roberto Lising were in the black car, now forming a small convoy, all headed for San Fernando, Pampanga. Whilst all of this was happening and as the hours ticked by, both Castaños and Bernabe families started worrying about Beebom and Cochise. When the couple did not return that very evening and the day after, the family conducted their own searches. They made inquiries at hospitals, restaurants, friends' houses, and other possible locations where the couple could have gone either before or after their planned dinner date, but all to no avail. That was until one group of this search party made it to Dairit's Hammond Burger House, not knowing that it was there that the young couple had originally intended to dine. The search group started asking around and they found witnesses, one of whom was a man named Froilan Olympia, who told them that a couple, fitting the description of Cochise and Beebom, were seen taken by men believed to be members of the military. With this lead also came the deluge of headlines about Cochise and Beebom. It quickly became the subject of many headlines in all major newspapers. And so naturally, the families used this opportunity to plead with the public, to ask anyone to come forward with any kind of information that could possibly help them find their beloved son and daughter. However, what started out as a promising lead in their search for Cochise and Beebom quickly became the only lead for the next weeks to come. Nothing came of the police's investigation or the family's search for about 2 months. By the 21st of June 1990, the momentum of the case would be picked up yet again. However, before we fast forward to June 1990, let us go back to the night Cochise and Beebom were abducted and driven to Pampanga. Please note that the following theory of the case was put together by the prosecution during the trial of the accused in this case back in May 1991. As you may remember, Cochise and Beebom were taken to San Fernando, Pampanga. On the way there, Filimon Garcia informed Manalili, who was still in Manila at that time, that the operation was a success and that he should head to Pampanga as soon as possible. Manalili followed Garcia's advice and headed to Pampanga by car. Lising, Garcia, Dizon, and Manga first brought Cochise and Beebom to a hotel called Valle Verde Lodge. In some reports, I understood that Manalili arrived at the hotel to meet the group, and in other reports, it does look like Manalili met them later at a different location. At this point, the statements of the accused men diverge a little bit. They all testified that as soon as Beebom saw Manalili, she pleaded with him, saying in Tagalog, "Uncle, parang awa mo na, wala kaming kasalanan. Uncle, have mercy, we have not done anything wrong." But Manalili simply ignored her. Now, whilst everybody agreed that this interaction between Beebom and Manalili took place, it seemed to me that the interactions between the men themselves before and after this little exchange were somehow contradictory. Let me explain. In Lising's account, he said that when Manalili saw the young couple, they were identified as Roberto Herrera and Joy Manalili, meaning that Rudy Manalili deliberately deceived the other men, having the end goal of murdering both Cochise and Beebom, as this had always been the plan. In Filimon Garcia's account during the trial, he stated that Manalili identified the young couple as Cochise and Beebom and ordered the men to release them as they were not the target of their little operation. Manalili reassured Lising that he would still get paid. Lising apparently agreed to release the couple. However, when Manalili left, Lising revealed some other plans. Lising told Garcia to bring the couple to a warehouse, of which we will hear more later. The plan was to kill both Cochise and Beebom in order to silence them as they were potential witnesses. Now don't worry, I will briefly touch upon this confusing part later on, but for now, let us move forward in our timeline. By 2 in the morning, already on the 26th of April 1990, the group finally headed to the aforementioned warehouse owned by Lising's common-law wife, Ligaya Fausto. They then woke up Raul Morales, one of the prosecution's witnesses later on, who worked in that warehouse and who also lived there permanently. Raul Morales was able to easily identify his relative, Roberto Lising, who he also knew as Rambo. Despite not knowing the names of the others in the two cars back then, Raul Morales would later be able to identify them as Filemon Garcia and the others as well. He was also able to identify Cochise and Beebom as the passengers of both the green and black cars. Raul then observed how Cochise and Beebom were bound and how later on their faces were also somehow partially covered by pieces of cloth. He also testified that Garcia disappeared for a few minutes and came back with a spade, after which he signaled Rambo to bring over Cochise near where the toilets were, at the back of the warehouse. We would later on learn that when Garcia disappeared, he was actually digging a shallow grave in preparation for what was about to happen next. As for Beebom, she was taken to another area in the warehouse, which was out of sight and out of earshot of Cochise. At the back of the warehouse, Lising handed a knife over to Garcia, signaling him to kill Cochise. Garcia stabbed Cochise once in the chest and then stopped. Lising was not happy with this action and grabbed the knife from Garcia only to stab Cochise himself multiple times in the chest and stomach area, as if showing Garcia how to properly do it. Cochise could not even move or evade the attacks on him, even if he wanted to. Not only was he blindfolded, but he was also being restrained by Dizon, who held him this whole time and after he fell unconscious. It was also Dizon who ordered Robin Manga to help him carry Cochise to the shallow grave that Garcia had dug earlier. Lising, Garcia, Dizon, and Manga then started covering Cochise with soil as he laid in the shallow grave. Cochise had died in such a brutal way and was buried so disrespectfully that it was only fair to believe that Beebom's fate was not going to be any better. After the four men killed Cochise, they returned to where Manalili and Beebom were in the warehouse. Manalili told them that they were all to leave the warehouse now and that Beebom would be going with them as well. Beebom inquired as to where her boyfriend was. She was told that he was released and that it was likely that she would be released as well. I think despite this sounding like good news, Beebom knew deep inside that she was being lied to. And so the five men left the warehouse with her after she was pushed yet again into the green Lancer car. A little bit later, Beebom was transferred into the black car before driven to the next barangay called San Agustin. And there, the men killed the 22-year-old. Reports at that time also claimed that she may have been raped before her death, as her body would later be found without any underwear. And just like that, the two young lives of Cochise and Beebom were extinguished. In the hours after Cochise and Beebom's murders, the men made sure to first and foremost get rid of the green Lancer car. The car was initially brought to Ligaya Fausto's home in San Fernando, Pampanga, where it stayed before it was repainted to avoid it being identified as belonging to the Bernabe family. The men also got paid on this day. Manalili gave Lising the remaining 40,000 pesos he was promised, and Lising cashed in that money right away. Lising also made sure that the others also got paid that very same day. And really, that would have been it. The secrets in Pampanga would have stayed in Pampanga were it not for two young men who presented themselves at Pasay City Hall in June 1990. It was a Thursday. Rosie Bernabe, who worked at the Pasay City Hall at that time, was just going about her day when two security guards who worked in a warehouse in San Fernando, Pampanga, came to see her on the 21st of June 1990. They told her that they had information about her son. Suddenly, Rosie felt like there was a huge pit in her stomach, but she kept her cool and referred the two guards to the so-called CAPCOM, or Capital Regional Command, so that both of them could be formally interviewed by them. And so the guards were invited by the CAPCOM officers, and they proceeded to tell their story. According to them, their two friends named Raul Morales and June Medrano, both of whom worked for Roberto Lising, spilled the beans about how their boss, Lising, killed a mestizohin and a woman in their warehouse in Pampanga. Now, mestizohin derives from the word mestizo, a term usually used to describe someone of foreign and Filipino mixed heritage, someone who is most likely fair-skinned or white-passing, or someone who might be pure Filipino but nevertheless still looks like they're of mixed heritage. The officers at Capcom were presumably relieved to hear about this new lead, as nothing had panned out in their investigation for such a long time. They also knew that they had to act quickly before news of this new information could be leaked out to the public or press, potentially forcing the perpetrators into hiding. For the Capcom officers, they knew that they had to interview the two people mentioned by the security guards immediately. It is my understanding that they only picked up Raul Morales, who we have already met a few minutes ago, because he was either the only one they could find or because he was the only one with good information. And so Raul Morales eventually found himself face to face with the Capcom officers on the 23rd of June 1990, and he had a lot of things to say. But perhaps the most important part of his sworn statement was him implicating his relative and his boss's partner, Roberto Lising. Whilst police authorities were preparing to look for Lising and also his partner Ligaya Fausto, some horrible news reached the Bernabe and Castaños families. On the 25th of June 1990, Cochise's body was finally found using the information obtained from the witnesses interviewed so far. His death was deemed a homicide, and his cause of death was officially declared as multiple stab wounds. Now, just a side note here, I don't mean to be nitpicky, but I think I mentioned in a previous episode that cause of death is different from manner of death. I am hazarding a guess here that the immediate cause of death was severe blood loss in Cochise's case because of the multiple stab wounds, which to me is the manner of death. But anyway, let us move on. On the 26th of June 1990, Beebom's body was also recovered a few kilometers away from the warehouse where Cochise was found. Her body was in a very advanced stage of decomposition. During autopsy, it was concluded that she sustained 2 stab wounds in the chest and had therefore died of severe blood loss as well. So whilst the two families were devastated to learn the details of the young couple's deaths, the police had to move quickly to find a most important witness and suspect, Roberto Lising. The police authorities assumed correctly at that time that by pursuing Lising, they would be getting closer to the truth. Lising managed to evade arrest for at least a week, but he was finally apprehended on the 30th of June 1990. In his sworn statement, he finally implicated all the other men in the group, and soon enough the police were hell-bent on arresting Filemon Garcia and Rodolfo Manalili, given the big role they played in this case. The arrests of Garcia and Dizon took place in early 1991, but much to the dismay of both the police and the rest of the country, Manalili could not be arrested because he was abroad. He was in Australia at that point, but of course that did not stop the police authorities, specifically the National Bureau of Investigation or NBI, from taking action in getting him back to the Philippines. Rodolfo Manalili was back on Filipino soil by mid-January 1991 after being escorted by then NBI Director Alfredo Lim himself. By May 1991, the trial of Manalili, Garcia, Lising, Dizon, and Manga commenced. By the 1st of June 1992, a decision was finally handed down. All men were found guilty of murder beyond a reasonable doubt. The murders were considered aggravated in nature because they involved treachery, and the court also found that there was not only premeditation, but an abuse of public position by Lising, Manga, and Dizon, who we all know were police officers. All 5 of them were sentenced to life in prison, and all needed to pay Cochise and Beebom's families not only damages but money to make up for any future loss of earnings and all the costs for the funeral for both families. Furthermore, all men were found guilty of slight illegal detention aggravated by the use of a motor vehicle and were therefore additionally sentenced to a little over than 17 years in prison, plus an order to pay any connecting costs. Ligaya Fausto was charged with being an accessory after the fact but was acquitted due to insufficient evidence. Naturally, all of the 5 convicted criminals appealed their verdict and sentences, but this appeal was denied in 1998 because the Supreme Court actually affirmed the decision of the trial court with regards to the murder verdict. Now, in a weird but rather satisfying twist of events, the Supreme Court found that the trial court should have found the man guilty of kidnapping as well, and not just slight illegal detention. The Supreme Court therefore upgraded their sentences to another life sentence with regards to the kidnapping. Now, I know you may have some questions that I initially also had when I read the case for the first time. The most obvious one is with regards to the initial quote-unquote mission of the men to arrest Roberto Herrera and then ending up abducting and murdering Cochise and Beebom instead. I know we have heard how in one account it would seem like Manalili was not bothered that his men abducted Cochise and Beebom and even deceived the men into believing that yes, they indeed managed to abduct Roberto Herrera and Joy Manalili as well, even though neither Joy nor any woman was part of this operation. This account presupposes that Cochise was the main target after all, and Beebom was merely collateral damage. This also presupposes that Manalili either did not care if either Herrera or Cochise were abducted, as revenge on one or the other seemed okay to him. In the second account, an account that was greatly valued by Manalili's defense lawyers, by the way, Filimon Garcia painted an innocent picture of Manalili who was benevolent and even ordered the release of the young couple as soon as he realized the mistake. This account was even pushed during the appeal, but the Supreme Court correctly pointed out that Manalili could not possibly rely on that account because it firstly seemed implausible anyway, and it also does not exonerate him either. The Supreme Court had a huge bone to pick with Manalili, who they considered very much guilty in masterminding this whole operation with the end goal of murdering Cochise. This was never a case of mistaken identity gone wrong or henchmen gone rogue, according to the Supreme Court. Manalili knew he was up to no good when he hired police officers from Pampanga to arrest a suspect involved in a case in Quezon City. There never was any evidence that Herrera was going to be arrested in Quezon City anyway, nor could Rudy Manalili present in court any copy of any arrest warrant for Herrera. The arrest story was just that, a fictional story. As a private citizen, it was never Manalili's job to arrest anyone anyway. The manner that this arrest operation was conducted was also very much unorthodox and of course illegal, especially considering that police officers were involved. The Supreme Court was not done yet. They also explained that if Manalili really wanted Cochise and Beebom released because he realized how his men had made a mistake by abducting this couple, he could have easily just taken the couple with him back to Manila, especially because he apparently knew what Lee Sing had in mind with regards to silencing the couple later on by killing them. Now, this was all to say that when one strips this case to its very core, what Manalili conspired to do was murder. Pure and simple. He ordered a hit job and Cochise was the original target and always had been. This was planned and there never was an arrest, but since Manalili offered a huge amount of money, no one questioned the arrest story out of greed and out of apathy. This is especially a hard pill to swallow considering that it was police officers who ultimately murdered the young couple. These are the same people who we are supposed to trust in dangerous situations such as the one Cochise and Beebom found themselves in. Now, after the convicted murderers in this case commenced their jail time, the families of Cochise and Beebom thought they could finally close this painful chapter in their lives, but unfortunately, they were wrong. In 2009, during the Macapagal Arroyo administration, Rudy Manalili would become one of many convicted criminals who were granted clemency in the then president's questionable murderers' clemency spree. In another episode in this podcast, I discussed how President Macapagal Arroyo also granted Claudio Tihanki Jr. clemency despite his brutal murder of young Maureen Holtman and Roland Chapman. You may also remember how Arroyo also pardoned disgraced President Ejercito Estrada despite having been convicted of plunder in 2007. Following the release of Manalili, there was great outrage. Senator Kiko Pangilinan, who was a close friend of Cochise, wrote the following in a press release from the 3rd of April 2009. Quote, "The decision to grant clemency to Rodolfo Manalili is deplorable. The murders of Cochise and Beebom were gruesome and totally reprehensible. To grant clemency to a convict who had two persons murdered for the simple reason that the law allows for it is victimizing the murdered victims and their families twice over." End of quote. Many felt like Manalili's release was a step to garner brownie points from his rich family, people who Arroyo may have wanted to tap for financial support in the upcoming 2010 elections. After all, both President Arroyo and the Manalilis hail from Pampanga, so maybe this was not too far-fetched. Nevertheless, the damage was done and cannot be undone. The families of Cochise and Beebom were reminded that they could neither trust the police, who ultimately killed their children, nor their own president to uphold the rule of law. I can only imagine that with this development came all the old hurt and pain from losing a child in such a brutal way, in such a senseless act of revenge and violence. The families will always be left wondering, what if? What if the couple had lived? Cochise would have become a charming lawyer, maybe a politician. Maybe Beebom would have gone into investigative reporting. The truth is, we will never know. The reality is that the future was robbed of these two bright lives that will now only live in the memories and hearts of their loved ones. Lagim fam, thank you so much for listening to this episode. This case has been requested so many times, and so I hope you found it interesting. The main source I used in my research was the 1998 Supreme Court decision, as it is the most reliable of all the sources I have found online. Now, if you found this episode interesting and if you like my podcast, make sure to follow me on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, and don't forget to rate and review me in those platforms as well. Make sure to also follow me on all my social media accounts for updates amongst many other things. All the links are available below. Also, do not forget the affiliate links that are in the show notes as well. Again, thank you so much for listening. Maraming salamat at mabuhay.